Germany. Its early 20th century history is mostly associated with the First World War, and then, after a period of about 20 to 30 years, the Second World War, in which Germany became a fascist, more specifically a National Socialist, government style, and they embarked on their conquest of large parts of Europe and later on the world. But another type of authoritarian ideology that was also present during this time in Europe was of course communism, but this is never really associated that much with Germany during this period. But that's not to say that it didn't play an important role in Germany, and this is what I'm going to look at in this video. So, first of all, if we go to early 1917, Germany is still technically a constitutional monarchy with a Kaiser, which is the German word for emperor, on the throne, although there is some limited suffrage and some kinds of democracy with the Reichstag, for example, a type of parliament. Now, during this time, of course, Germany was involved in the First World War and fought on the side of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire against the likes of the British, the French, the Belgians, and the Russians. Now, of course, in 1917, the Russians had a revolution, and during this revolution, the old Tsar, or the old sort of an emperor in Russia, was overthrown by communist, or more specifically Bolshevik revolutionaries in the November Revolution. And this led to the establishment of the first quote-unquote communist situation in Europe, the first communist style of government in Europe. And of course this sent shockwaves through Europe, because while this was the first communist government, there were communists in every country in Europe, and this was a big inspiration to them. Now, in Germany, there were voices who opposed the war, and generally the communists and socialists around Europe opposed the war and saw it as the upper classes taking advantage of the lower classes. If you're interested, I've got my video on both the Russian Revolution and on the Peaky Blinders, where I actually talk about some of these issues, if this sounds like something you'd be interested in. So, of course, at the start in Germany, you had a very important party called the SPD, which was the Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschland, which is sort of the fairly centre-left kind of party that was advocating for more social welfare and that kind of thing. And they were for supporting the war effort during this time. They weren't particularly fond of the war, but they thought we need to get behind the government during this time. But then people in the SPD actually were not in favour as well of getting involved in the war effort, and they asked why, and these were generally the more hardline leftists, so people who were more socialist or communist, for example. And actually, it comes to a head, obviously, 1918, things start to go badly for the Germans in the war, and on the 8th of November, the Kaiser is, he doesn't choose to abdicate first. First of all, he was told on the public radio that he had abdicated before he actually abdicated, but he did abdicate later that day. And this led to the founding of a new, more democratic system with pretty much universal suffrage in Germany. Of course, the old imperial system fell, and a new republic, the Weimar Republic, was proclaimed, with, soon after the elections, the first president of the Weimar Republic and the de facto leader at the start of the SPD, called Friedrich Ebert. However, there were also people who weren't happy with this new system, and many of these were the aforementioned further left politicians who wanted to implement a similar style government as was now ruling in Russia. And this was because the start of these revolutions, which I have made a video on if you're interested, was because when they started to get annoyed with the Kaiser and the situation, there was a very left-wing movement of mainly communists and socialists who were rising up against the old system. For example, the Kiel mutineers, as well as the Wilhelmshaven mutineers and other things like that. And they decided that they wanted a revolution. Now, actually, it wasn't really the leadership who decided they wanted or needed a revolution, apart from Karl Liebknecht, who was an important figure. It was mostly the underclasses who were annoyed with the Weimar Republic and thought they had to act now before there was another election. Now, they started to arm up around Christmas time in 1918. And another important figure, of course, was Rosa Luxemburg, who is quite a famous name now. She advocated not for an armed revolution, but it kind of happened without her wanting to happen. Karl Liebknecht was more in favour of it, I believe. But essentially, the working classes, the communists in German cities, mainly Berlin, it was mainly focused around Berlin, although other areas were affected, started to arm up. And this was a large concern, obviously, to the democratically elected government. Now, this, as I said, mostly happened in Berlin, but other industrial areas in Germany also started to have unrest. And by unrest, it can be anything from general strikes by hard leftists to actually armed revolts and trying to take over various parts. So, for example, in Bremen, Hamburg, the Rhineland, the Ruhr, and also Saxony, I believe, as well as Bavaria. These places all became variously disenfranchised with the new republic and started to rise up. So what was the government's response? Well, one might expect them to send in the army to deal with this armed insurrection, but they don't actually do this for a number of reasons. Reason number one is that during a lot of the unrest that toppled the Kaiser and the chancellorship of Prince Max von Baden, is that a lot of these men were in the army, so perhaps Friedrich Ebert feared that sending in the army might actually have the opposite effect, and that some units from the army, who themselves, some of them, had anti-capitalist, more socialist sentiments, might join in with the rebels. Now, this, of course, is not what he wanted. Second of all is actually the opposite of this, that there were also army units who were incredibly conservative, and by and large all of the generals and upper echelons of the armed forces in Germany were of the old Junker elite, of the old Prussian style of aristocracy, and he feared that they might be too harsh in dealing with the rebels. Of course, Friedrich Ebert didn't want to alienate any group in Germany at this point. The Weimar Republic was on very shaky legs, and he wanted to keep everyone on side, be they from the traditional right and the traditional middle classes, der Mittelstand, or from the harder left-wing groups, who he hoped to win back over to the SPD, to the Sozialdemokraten. So what Ebert did instead was to send in the Freikorps. Now, the Freikorps were mainly made up of old German army veterans. Now, after the end of the First World War, things were really quite disorganized in Germany, and everyone expected some sort of revolution to take place. And a lot of the soldiers, it's hard to talk about all of them in one homogeneous group, because they weren't, as I just mentioned. There were some who were more left-wing, whereas the higher-up members in the army were more right-wing, but there are definitely distinctions to this. And a lot of them actually formed Freikorps, which literally means free corps in German. And these were essentially roving bands of soldiers who hadn't been disbanded yet, but they weren't under full control of the government. Now, this was also used by the government. They weren't just brigands who were out of the armed services and decided to do what they liked with guns to enforce their rule of law. They were actually used by the government because after the armistice on the 11th of November 1918, the instructions were put in place on the German army that they weren't allowed over a certain amount of men. Now, of course, if these were Freikorps or free corps, then the government could say, oh, well, we don't have any command over them. Whereas in actual fact, they actually did have quite a lot of influence in these Freikorps and could use them, whereas they could claim, oh, that they aren't part of the army, so we are keeping to the agreements of this armistice, which is what they essentially did. Now, meanwhile, in Berlin, mostly Berlin, also a few other places in Germany, which I will probably make another video about because they are quite separate to this movement. The Spartacist Uprising has begun, and this is the name given to this uprising, which happened in 1919 in Berlin, and on the 4th of January is usually the date that it's accepted to have started. Now, what actually happened was that Berlin was essentially taken over by these left-wing militias who had armed themselves, by the people in the Spartacist League, and this was a league of hardline communists who wanted to take control in Germany to seize the means of production and to create a similar state to the one in Russia at the time, which was obviously a Soviet state. And what they did was they would block off roads, they took over public areas in Berlin and essentially claimed that the revolution had started. So what was the government's response? Well, they sent in the Freikorps, which were obviously these units. And the Freikorps, being just returned from the Western Front, they had a lot of very good military equipment, a lot better than the fairly rudimentary equipment given to these left-wing insurgents. And it wasn't long before the Freikorps started to gain an upper hand in Berlin in dealing with these militias. Now, the two erstwhile leaders, although even they really didn't want to lead in actual fact, Rosa Luxemburg especially, they were rather more unfortunate and caught unaware by this revolution that was happening. They were found in a Berlin apartment and they were arrested by armed forces and given over to the nearest Freikorps regiment. and they were both executed in captivity. So it wasn't long before the whole uprising in Berlin started to fall apart, and they soon gave up, and generally the date given to the end of the Spartacist Rising in Berlin is the 15th of January, so it really hadn't lasted very long at all. However, this wasn't the end to the communist threat in Germany, and they would try again to take over not only all of Germany but also certain parts of Germany, and they actually succeeded in some areas, although I think that'll be an interesting video for another time. As well as this, it left the president that the German president wasn't able to control the country. As to the German people, they actually saw the sending in of the Freikorps as being a true sign that all control had been lost, and that there was no real power able to save them from the threat of the hard left. Of course, as well, this gave the Freikorps a huge ego boost and let the right-wing elite in the country think that they had a chance to restore power, perhaps by using the Freikorps. And this would all come to a head very soon, which I will also make another video about. Alright everyone, so thank you very much for watching. This has been my video on the Communist Rising, or the Spartacist Rising, in 1918, or 1919 rather, it sort of bridges the two, in Germany, which almost made Germany a communist country. I say almost. It did fail quite spectacularly for several reasons, one being that the leaders, some of them weren't really that keen on doing a revolution, the other reason being that the troops who were armed against them were much better armed than the actual rebels themselves, and the third being that they didn't really have much support from the working classes, only from the real hardliners. It seems that enough people were satisfied enough with the new form of government being proposed, the Weimar Republic, that they didn't take up arms against it. But of course it did weaken the Weimar government significantly, because it made people think that the Weimar government couldn't actually do anything to protect them, which is why these roving bands of right-wing death squads were sent in instead to deal with them. So thanks for watching. I've been History with Hilbert, and this has of course been the Spartacist Rising of 1990.